What's happening, everybody? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. Every once in a while, the news hits or a story hits, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. That's expected. I kind of saw that coming a mile away, and every once in a while, it's the exact opposite, and something just comes out of nowhere. Aaron Rodgers and the trade situation, maybe there were some cookie crumbs there, but on draft day, all of a sudden going from 0 to 100, where maybe he's upset to all of a sudden potentially looking like he's going to be a Denver Bronco, that's something that to that extent a little bit came out of nowhere, right? Another example of this on a much, much smaller scale is Ben Braden out of nowhere. So why are we talking about Ben Braden today? Well, let me recap just a little bit for those of you who didn't catch the offensive coaches and their press conferences from yesterday. A very interesting quote from offensive line coach Adam Stenavich. Now, if I would have told you that Adam Stenavich would have came out and said, hey, you know what? I think Ben Braden is practicing really well, and I think he has a really nice shot to compete in training camp and maybe earn himself a roster spot. You'd be like, oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. That's a really nice note for Ben Braden and, maybe somebody to earmark and keep in mind for training camp and how some of those offensive line battles pan out. But he came out, and this is his quote. I'm really excited about Ben and what's going to happen with him. I think he's really going to compete for a starting job at guard or tackle. That's not nothing. That is a massive statement. One more time, I'm really excited about Ben and what's going to happen with him. I think he's really going to compete for a starting job at guard or tackle. That is an incredible statement for Ben Braden. Good news for you, Ben, and kudos to you for the work apparently you've been doing to earn that sort of praise. This is a team where, they got David Bakhtiari and they've got Billy Turner. They just drafted Josh Myers, of course, Elton Jenkins, and has spent a ton of draft capital over the last 2 seasons on the offensive line, whether that be the aforementioned, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr., Simon Stepaniak, Jake Hansen, Cole Van Lanen, Royce Newman. And some of those were later round picks. In fact, 4 of them were 6th round picks, if I remember correctly. But even with that being said, that is, all things aside, that is a massive statement for Ben Braden. All those offensive linemen that they have on the roster, all those offensive linemen that they just drafted, and Ben Braden is all of a sudden entered into a competition and in the conversation for a starting spot. So again, I think this is definitely a story worth telling and a story worth digging into a little bit more because, again, for the most part, it really came out of nowhere. So let's rewind a little bit for those of you who are not as familiar with who the heck Ben Braden is. Actually was an undrafted free agent out of Michigan. Started with the New York Jets from 2017 to 2019. Was on, kind of flip-flopping between their roster, their practice squad, and so on and so forth. He's ultimately released by the Jets in 2019. The Packers picked him up, added him to their practice squad. This is actually back in 2019. They ended up ultimately releasing him from the practice squad. Guess where he goes? He goes back to the Jets, spends 2019 and 2020, again, flip-flopping between the practice squad and the active roster, ends up getting cut, goes to the New England Patriots for a cup of coffee about a month not preseason since there wasn't one last year, but during training camp last year, gets cut and basically roster cut downs. In October of last year, he signs with the Packers, goes back and forth between the practice squad and the active roster, ends on the active roster, and then of course gets re-signed or is still on the roster here going into this season. And here we are. And Ben Braden all of a sudden very much in the competition. So just a quick kind of scouting report on Braden coming out of college. Actually had a 9.05 RAS score from Kent Lee Platte, which again, it puts him basically in the 90th percentile overall for athletes at the guard position throughout the history of what they have data for in the NFL draft and combine and things like that. So high-end athlete, 6'6", 329 pounds, good size, fluid mover. You go back and you watch him at Michigan and you can see the athleticism on tape. Again, very clean mover, can get from point A to point B. He can get to the second level and moves very well for that 6'6", 329 size. Started 36 games at Michigan, which is not insignificant. He had great versatility, started games at tackle, started them at guard, and again, carries that versatility over into the NFL. And ultimately, as an undrafted guy, late round pick coming out of Michigan, was a player in that draft that I really liked and had my eye on. Now, I'm not saying he was ready to come in and compete or should have been a third or fourth round pick or anything like that, but definitely thought that he was a player that, as an undrafted guy, if you could get him, develop him a little bit, that he had some of those traits and developmental upside that you could kind of develop over time. So what was kind of some of the issues coming out? Well, frankly, probably the biggest one is he just wasn't very good at Michigan. He's solid, but unspectacular. Really bothered, especially when he was at tackle, with speed off the edge and kind of handling more of the speed rushers. Just didn't have the foot quickness. Again, he has the athleticism, but it's the technique that kind of let him down. Played far too top heavy, had a propensity to bend at the waist, which is usually a cardinal sin for an offensive lineman. You want to bend your knees, get down, get low, stay balanced. You're bending at the waist, you're losing all balance. Defensive linemen can use that against you. Obviously not something you want to get in the habit of doing. Really struggle with maintaining blocks and playing with consistency in that regards, despite his great size. Somebody you think would have that great physicality, be able to latch on and maintain blocks. That wasn't the case with Braden. And again, just needed a lot of technique work. But this is the classic type of player that Green Bay really likes to develop. He has high-end athleticism, versatility along the offensive line. He's a hard worker. And ultimately, what does he need? He needs a little bit of technique work, or in this case, maybe a lot of technique work. And going and spending time with the Jets, the Packers, back to the Jets, the Patriots, the Packers. The fact is, as that type of player, you've been able to stick around and keep grinding and get those chances. That doesn't always happen for undrafted free agents. And when you start bouncing around the league a little bit, it's very easy for you to find yourself on the outside looking in. For Braden, he's been able to continue to latch on, continue to grow as a player, to the point where now Adam Stenavich is saying he can compete for a starting spot. Ultimately, I believe he projects best as a guard. Now, again, for those unfamiliar with David Bakhtiari injured, with Elton Jenkins out from practice yesterday, or 2 days ago, I should say, he was the one that was lining up with the starters at left tackle. And it's great for him to get some reps there. And the fact that he has that versatility is amazing. I do think he ultimately plugs best at guard. And I think the best thing here is a player like Ben Braden, and what we've seen, and Josh Myers is another great example of this. Royce Newman is a great example of this. These type of players who maybe weren't always the best in college, but have all the traits, have all the tools, have the right frame of mind, have all the intangibles. I've seen enough from Luke Butkus and Adam Stenavich that they're going to be able to get the most out of these type of players. And I'm really excited to see how some of these young guys develop, whether it's a John Runyon Jr., a Josh Myers, if you even want to include a Ben Braden in that, Simon Stepaniak, all of those guys. I'm really excited to see, Royce Newman, how these players develop under the tutelage of Stenavich and Butkus, because I think they've done tremendous work already. I think Corey Linsley and David Bakhtiari continue to improve on their stellar careers, even with them over the last couple seasons. I thought Billy Turner, kicking out to tackle, played some of his best football. Rick Wagner had a major revitalization for the vast majority of last season. They've gotten the most out of players. And now you're starting to see some of these young guys really get, even Lucas Patrick last year played really well. So I think the interesting aspect here, and the interesting thing here, is they've got this talented player in Ben Braden that now is maybe starting to come out of his shell a little bit, has now the technique work maybe down a little bit more. Maybe he's ready to compete. Whether or not he ends up being a starter or not remains to be seen. But when your offensive line coach says that he's really excited about him and sees him as a potential starter on the offensive line, that certainly makes it much more likely that he's going to be one of those 9 to 10 offensive linemen that ultimately make the roster. It would be a pretty disappointing, flip of the script at this point if, you go from OTAs where your offensive line coach is saying, I think he's going to compete for a starting spot, to getting to, August or September and he's released and doesn't make final cutdowns, right? That would seem like something has gone very, very wrong. And at this point, I'm not saying you can put it in permanent marker, but I think you have to pencil in Ben Braden as one of the offensive linemen that makes the roster, just based off of that statement from Adam Stenavich. So where does that leave you? Well, we know David Bakhtiari, Elton Jenkins, Josh Myers, John Runyon Jr., Billy Turner, Royce Newman, and now maybe Ben Braden are making the roster. That would be 7 guys if, in fact, Braden makes the team. Now that leaves 2 to 3 spots for everyone else, including Yosh Nijman, Lucas Patrick, Simon Stepaniak, Jake Hansen, Cole Van Lanen, and then some of your undrafted guys over the last couple of years, Zach Johnson, Coy Cronk, John Dietzen, Jacob Capra, etc. But there might only be 2 spots for guys like Yosh Nijman, Lucas Patrick, Stepaniak, Hansen, Van Lanen. Like, that's not a ton. Even if there's 3, 2 of those guys would be gone. So I think that this is going to really press the envelope, especially for players like Yosh Nijman and Lucas Patrick. Listen, those draft picks, Simon Stepaniak, Cole Van Lanen, they're going to have a little bit of a leg up to make the roster as maybe those 8th and 9th guys because they were draft picks. Jake Hansen got cut a season ago. I didn't see much from him in training camp last year. I'll be interested to see. I do think a lot of the draft picks, drafting a center again, drafting 3 interior offensive linemen, I don't think things look great for Jake Hansen right now, but hopefully he can turn things around and get things going a little bit. But the interesting one here is Lucas Patrick. And ultimately, if you have the choice between a player who has guard tackle versatility or guard center versatility, you want the guy with guard tackle versatility. And at the end of the day, if they feel like Ben Braden and Lucas Patrick are fairly interchangeable and Braden can be basically Lucas Patrick, maybe better, maybe slightly worse, Ben Braden gets the nod there. And Lucas Patrick is one of the few players that has the ability, for that Green Bay could potentially actually release and actually have some cap savings from doing so. And as Green Bay is trying everything they can to pinch pennies and get through this season, that's a real option. Now, I'm not saying it's a great option, and I'm not saying I want to see Lucas Patrick not on this team. I think he's a valuable depth piece along this offensive line. But you do get to the point where if John Runyon Jr. and Ben Braden all of a sudden look like starters, and now maybe a Simon Stepaniak or a Cole Van Lanen look better than you expected, maybe a Royce Newman looks like he could potentially start inside, now you start saying, hey, I'm not sure we really need to pay a Lucas Patrick any money. We've got enough of these type of players along the offensive line already. So am I recommending it? No. Again, I really like Lucas Patrick. I think he's a really nice depth piece, but listen, if Josh Sitton can get cut for salary cap purposes right before the start of the season, so can Lucas Patrick, right? We've seen these type of moves before. Ultimately, what does this mean? What does this statement mean from Adam Stenavich for Ben Braden? I think, one, it means that he is definitely a name to keep an eye on in training camp and through the preseason. How does he perform? If he performs remotely well, chalk him into one of those roster spots because, again, high praise with good play on the field, he's not going anywhere. I also think that it could mean trouble for some of those players like Yosh Nijman, Lucas Patrick, Simon Stepaniak, Cole Van Lanen, Jake Hansen. Again, if Braden's on the roster, just not that many spots to go around. So I think it's likely that he makes the team based on those comments today. I think he's going to be somebody that's going to be fun to watch this upcoming offseason and through training camp and through everything else. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this offensive line battle shakes out with now another name kind of rising to the top as a potential contender, not only to make the roster, but potentially start, which is, again, a really crazy thought that I did not think I would be discussing today. And oh, by the way, last note here, he's on contract this season. Next season, he would be a restricted free agent. So in the event that he comes in and all of a sudden he does earn a starting spot and he balls out and looks amazing, they would be able to bring him back for fairly cheap next year on a restricted free agent deal. So that is potentially some good news as well. That's going to do it for me today. Hope you learned a little bit more about Ben Braden. Excited to see how he progresses throughout the offseason. I'll be right back here tomorrow. Make sure to check out Andrew and Kyle on today's audio version of the podcast. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.